to continue on with our histology video, it's time now to go into your favorite histology category, bones. Now, as you remember, just as a little review, there are, histology is the study of tissues. So, hist would mean tissues, and ology is the study of. So the study of bone tissues, or osseous tissue as it's called. If you remember from the previous histology video, there are 4 types of tissue. There is nervous tissue, there is muscle tissue, there is epithelial tissue, and there is connective tissue. So for our bones, we're going to be focusing on connective tissue. Now, connective tissue there are 4 types of connective tissue. There is proper, and if you remember from my previous video, that's like the jello in a jello mold. It connects all of the other things that are floating around in there. And there is cartilage. There's bone. Bone is a connective tissue. And there is blood. Blood is also a connective tissue. And out of these 4 types of connective tissues, we are going to be zeroing in on all 3 of these for our bones, because not only is our skeleton made of just bone connective tissue, but it also has cartilage in it, and cartilage plays a big part in the formation of bone. And blood is also involved because bone plays a big part in the formation of blood. So cartilage plays a big part in the formation of bone. Bone plays a big part in the formation of blood. Now, before you can have bone, you have to have cartilage. So let's look at cartilage first. So skeletal cartilage and in some ways skeletal cartilage is the precursor to bone, but we'll get into that in a little while. So skeletal cartilage is a form of connective tissue, and like all cartilage, there are 2 components to cartilage. There is collagen, and that's fibrous, and there is elastin, and elastin is an elastic protein. Now, collagen, seeing that it's fibrous cartilage, collagen helps with providing support, and it's also a shock absorber, as we'll see later. The collagen in the cartilage acts as a shock absorber between bones and joints. So you're not having just bone to bone rubbed together on your joints. You have something there absorbing the shock, so it's not painful when you jog or exercise or move your body. Elastin is stretchy. because you think elastic and you think stretchy like a rubber band. Now, don't be confused. These two are the components of cartilage. This is what makes up cartilage: collagen and elastin. Now, but don't get that confused with the three types of cartilage. All important for bone tissue. And the three types of cartilage are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. All different kinds of cartilage, all important for your skeletal system. There are three types of cartilage. If you notice up here to the upper right, I made a note. Out of bones, there's two different, I guess, components, you would say, in bones in our skeletal system. And one is the skeletal cartilage, and the other one is osseous tissue. And osseous just means bone. So bone tissue and skeletal cartilage. Those are both components of bones, which is a component of connective tissue. Just so we know where we're at as far as the histology tree goes. So anyway, three types of cartilage. There is hyaline is the first, and this is the most abundant skeletal cartilage. It's collagen only, and it does a lot of things. It provides support, it's a shock absorber, and it does this by being situated at the ends of the bones, the ends of long bones. Because the ends of the bones are where the bones are going to connect to other bones and make joints. And so the hyaline cartilage will line just the ends of the bones to make it comfortable to hook up to another bone and make a joint. Just like if you wear socks under your shoes so your shoes don't hurt your feet. Now, the hyaline cartilage makes up your nose. The hyaline cartilage is in all of your bones, but you also want to just particularly pay attention to the fact that your nose is cartilage. It's not really mostly bone. It's just cartilage, and hyaline cartilage is what that nose is made of. Your ribs, your larynx, and the list could go on. Now your elastic is the most stretchy. Because obviously the name elastic. And the elastic is found in your ears and your epiglottis, which the epiglottis is this little piece of tissue back in your throat that folds over your windpipe, so when you're eating and chewing and swallowing, the food doesn't go down your wrong pipe and get into your lungs. It goes down through your esophagus and goes into your stomach. So the epiglottis is this little flap that keeps the food going where the food's supposed to go, and the air you breathe going where the air is supposed to go in your throat. And then fibrocartilage, finally, are for areas that need to withstand extreme amounts of pressure. So examples of that would be between your vertebrae, each individual vertebrae. You definitely would not want to be walking around with no cushioning, no fiber cartilage between each one of your vertebrae, because that would hurt. And if you've ever heard of anybody who's gotten a slipped disc before and it threw their back out, it really hurts. And it's the fiber cartilage between the vertebra gets knocked out of place. And so walking and doing any form of exercise or movement is just excruciatingly painful. So you want this fiber cartilage like a cushion between your vertebrae, and it's also found in the pubic symphysis. And when you study your skeleton and your joints as well, you'll find out what the pubic symphysis is. The pubic symphysis is just like, here's one half of your hip bone. This is your pelvis. And then here's the other half of your pelvis. And so right where these meet, between in the middle, there's this little thing of fiber cartilage right there. And it keeps your two halves of your pelvis from banging together and rubbing bone on bone. Also, this fiber cartilage relaxes when a woman is in labor, and it allows it to soften, and it allows the hips to separate to make room for the birth canal, for the birth of the baby. But either way, fiber cartilage is a very thick collagen, and it's known for its rigidity. Keeps everything nice and rigid and in its place. And of course, I forgot to mention, but you could probably infer that the elastic cartilage is made up of elastin. Now, cartilage is also very important because without cartilage, we would not be able to have bones, another connective tissue. Because what happens is that part of this cartilage that makes up part of the skeletal system will turn into bone. And it's a process called ossification. And again, there's that word osseous or ossi. Just like we have osseous tissue up here, meaning just bone tissue. This is just another form of the prefix for bone. So ossification and fication, turn into. And we'll get more into how the cartilage turns itself into bone, how bone is actually formed from cartilage in a little bit. It actually begins with the fetus in utero before a child is even born. It is made up of primarily cartilage instead of bones. It has a skeleton, but the skeleton is made up of mostly hyaline cartilage. And through ossification, in utero, it's called endochondral ossification, and we'll get into that in a minute. But in utero, there's a process that goes on where the cartilage is slowly transformed and converted into bone. And that process continues until you're in your mid-20s. When any of the cartilage that was going to convert into bone has converted into bone. Now, there's two ways for bone to grow. One is called appositional growth. And right now I'm just giving you this background information on all of this. We'll get to the fun stuff in a minute. But there's two ways for bones to grow: appositional growth and interstitial growth. Now, as you know, inter is a prefix meaning between or inner. And so interstitial growth is going to be, it's going to expand from within. So it's literally forming from the inside out. Appositional growth would be to grow from the outside by adding layers upon layers upon layers on the outside. So as you can see, when we start out with cartilage, skeletal cartilage, a lot of that skeletal cartilage is going to turn into bone, and then that's when we get the osseous tissue. Now, there are two components of bone, or there are two types of bone tissue, you could say, and one is the bone cells themselves, and the other is the bone matrix. And the matrix is extracellular, and that just means it's outside of the cells. And within the matrix are the bone cells that do most of the functioning of the bone. So first, just because it's much shorter and much easier, we're just going to take a look at the bone matrix for a minute. The bone matrix, as I said, is extracellular, and there are two components to the bone matrix. Seems like there's two components to everything in here. There's two components of a bone, or there's two components of connective tissue involved with the skeleton. That's the skeletal cartilage and the bone tissue. And there's two components of the bone tissue, and those are the cells in the matrix. And now there's two components of the matrix. And the two components of the matrix are the organic component and the inorganic component. So the organic component is called an osteoid. The inorganic component is called, wait for it, hydroxyapatite. It's a long word just to say it's the inorganic part of the bone matrix, hydroxyapatites. So an osteoid, the organic part, is made up of, let me get a different color here, is made up of ground substance, and you'll remember ground substance a little bit from the histology video on just general tissues. And it's made up of collagen fibers. And these are secreted by bone cells, by immature bone cells, which we'll get more involved in that later, so don't worry about if you understand that or not, but it's secreted by bone cells. Called osteoblasts. Now the inorganic, the hydroxyapatites, the inorganic part of the bone matrix, is like a crystal matrix with the minerals in it. This is where all the minerals go. You know how you need calcium for your bones? They always say calcium does a body good. It's good for your bones. So we have calcium. We also have phosphate. and we have water. And this makes up for the hardness of the bone, because it has the minerals in it. And this matrix surrounds the collagen fibers of the osteoid in the bone matrix, and that's what gives it strength. Inorganic hydroxyapatites hold all the minerals in the bones that you need, and that's what makes it. That's what makes your bones hard. Now, out of the cells and the matrix, both of those put together will equal your bones as we know them, as we think of them, your skeletal bones. And your skeletal bones can be classified a couple of different ways. First, let's just run down the functions really quickly, because there's always that test question: what is the function of the skeleton, or what are the functions of the bones? So let's run that down really quick. Bones are to support and protect, like the rib cage protects your heart and lungs from external elements. It supports you because you can't stand up without it. It stores minerals. Your bones store minerals. And we were just talking about that in the hydroxyapatites. They store the minerals, and that's what makes your bones hard. But they can also release the minerals into your bloodstream if you need some more minerals in your system. Like, for instance, calcium. If your blood levels, if your calcium levels in your blood are really low, that will trigger your body to release the calcium stored up in your bones, and release the calcium from your bones into your bloodstream to get those calcium levels back up in your blood, because you need calcium for other things in your body. Also, your bones are a stored room for fat, and your bones are the source of, or a source of, hormone formation, and the source of blood formation. Blood is made in your bones, and specifically it's made in the bone marrow. And I'm talking about all blood, not just red blood cells, RBCs for red blood cells, what we normally think of as blood, but also WBCs, white blood cells, for your immune system. So bones are very important so we can have blood. And also, probably the most obvious function of bones is movement. Because you can't move without your bones. Now, as I said, there are different ways you can classify your bones, and we use them. We use all of the ways to classify bones in anatomy and physiology. It just depends on what you're talking about and what you're referring to. So the first way to classify your bones is axial versus appendicular. Now, axial it's like your axis, the axis upon which your body pivots. So that's going to be your skull and your spine, or vertebrae. Since we're talking about bones, it would be your vertebrae, which holds your spine. Now appendicular, if you look at this append prefix, that stands for appendage. And appendage just means like a limb. So your arms, legs, and also this does include your shoulders and your pelvis. And those are what we call girdles, because those are where your limbs attach to your axial skeleton. Your legs attach at the pelvis to your vertebrae, and your arms attach at the shoulders to your vertebrae. So those are called girdles. But so appendicular is just your arms and your legs, and axial is your skull and your spine. So your first way of classifying bones is your axial skeleton versus your appendicular skeleton. Your second way of classifying bones is by their shape. I know it might seem pretty basic just to classify the bones by their shape, but it really makes everything make sense and puts everything together really nicely. So first, for by shape, you're going to have long bones, and those are pretty much the bones in your limbs, your arms and legs. Also, you're going to have, speaking of shorter, you're going to have short bones. And these are going to be more like cube-like shaped. Like some of the bones in your wrists and ankles. You are going to have flat bones, which flat bones is sort of a misnomer because they are usually, not only are they thin, but usually they are thin and curved a little bit. So they're not flat as in straight up and down. They're flat as in they're skinny. So from the thin and curved bones, your flat bones, you're going to have your ribs. So that's a good example of flat bones being thin and curved. And you're going to have your scapula, or your scapulae, which are your shoulder blades. And your sternum is another good example of it being flat and thin, flat bones. Now also you're going to have these are the three main ones, and then you're going to have a couple of rogue shapes here. One we just call irregular shaped bones, and that's almost like a catch-all category for any of the bones that don't fit these definitions up here. It's not long, they're not short, and they're not flat. They're irregularly shaped, so kind of miscellaneously shaped. So you're really weirdly shaped bones. Vertebrae are going to be irregularly shaped bones, and your pelvis, that's an irregularly shaped bones. If you have not come into the bone room lab and actually taken a look in person at the skeletal bones, you need to do so soon, because if I'm not mistaken, your lab test is going to be coming up, and they're going to quiz you on all of those bones names. So you need to get in there and study those bones anyway. But if you haven't come in and seen the bones for the pelvis yet. They're really trippy, and the bones for the vertebrae yet. They're really trippy, and they are definitely irregularly shaped. Also, you're going to have sesamoid bones, which is also kind of irregularly shaped, but the difference is that sesamoid bones are bones within a tendon. So they might be in joints. A good example of this is your patella, your kneecap. Your kneecap, or it's called your patella, sits within tendons from your femur, your upper thigh bone, and your tibia, your lower leg bone. There's tendons that go back and forth between those two major bones, and your patella sits in the middle of that, and that's your kneecap. So that would be classified as a sesamoid bone. Also, besides your patella, your pisiform bones are also the sesamoid bones, and your pisiform bones are just one of your wrist bones, so you have one on each hand. They're these little teeny tiny wrist bones. Also, if you have bone spurs, I know if you follow politics, bone spurs has definitely been mentioned once or twice in the past couple of years. So if you have something called bone spurs, those are typically classified as sesamoid bones. Now the only other shape or type of bone, classification of bone, is called suture or sutural bones. And those are just little tiny bones that happen to form within sutures. And you'll be familiar with sutures studying the skull. There are all sorts of sutures all over the skull that divides the different skull bones between each, and those harden as you get older. You're born with those being soft when you're a baby, and as you get older those harden and turn into sutures. But sometimes those sutures don't just turn into one long crack. Sometimes they kind of go rogue and they get little tiny bones within the sutures, and those are sutural bones. So those are the bone shapes, and you usually classify them. You're either talking about, just depending on what you're talking about, you can say your axial or your appendicular skeleton, talking about a whole section of your skeleton, or you can specify which bone you're talking about or which kind of bone you're talking about by the shape. So those are the types of bone tissues that we have, and those are the way to classify them and what their components are. This is just part one of the video. We'll get into the good stuff in the next video as we go through the anatomy of bones, especially the long bones right here, because long bones are usually the bones that you study when you study the anatomy of bones. And so we're going to get into that next video, but this is the background information that I thought it was important for you to be able to have before we get into that.